Thank you, Judith. As David said, I'm just down the road from him and we're in the middle of a thunderstorm. So if it all goes dark, you'll know why. What I'd like to do, as David said, is explore what we do by way of response to Pete Smith's tremendous introduction to the science last month. In particular, how faith communities can do this in worship and action and advocacy. And I'd like to touch on three recent developments to help us explore this. The first is how the Church of Scotland is responding to the climate emergency. Not saying that the Church of Scotland is doing this better than anybody else, but to say that we are facing, like other denominations, other faiths and many other organizations, a series of very real and very difficult challenges at the present time. The second, to introduce the United Nations Climate Conference, COP26, to say a little bit about that. And then thirdly, by concluding by considering this very new development, the demand for a just and green recovery from the human and economic trauma of the COVID pandemic. First then, the Church of Scotland, what are we doing? There was a report prepared for the General Assembly 2020. Now, as you all know, the Church of Scotland General Assembly 2020 was due to be held in May, and that was cancelled. Although there is now to be a mini assembly held in October this year, and we're hopeful that the report that was due to go up in May will be discussed in the mini assembly at the beginning of October. That report was about how do we respond to the climate emergency. And to give you just a flavour of that, three of the issues that were raised there. First was about listening to young people. Any child born in Scotland in this century is likely, given good luck, given the advances in medical science, to live for 70 or 80 or longer years. Children growing up in this century will feel the full force of climate change. As we progress into the second half of this century, it becomes more serious, much more serious than it is now. Therefore, when children or young people express anxiety about the future, about the impact of climate change on them, they quite rightly demand that we listen to what they are saying. And those concerns have been embodied in one person, Greta Thunberg, but they shared much more widely. And the children's protests last year from schools and colleges around the country demonstrate that. The question then we pose for the General Assembly is, how can individual congregations listen to children and listen to their concerns? What can you do in your churches, in your communities, to listen to young people and their worries and concerns? I pose that as one of the questions. The second theme we explore in the report is divestment. This debate has been going on for such a long time. I attended a meeting of Aberdeen Presbytery that discussed it last year. Maybe been going on for too long. And the time came towards the end of last year when the Church and Society Council and the new Faith Impact Forum of the Church of Scotland said, we've just got to get this done. We just have to now put a recommendation to the General Assembly without ambiguity, quite clearly saying it is now time for the Church of Scotland to sell its shares in oil and gas companies. So that proposal was developed, and we went to see the Church of Scotland Investors Trust about it, expecting a bit of a rough time, because up until now they've always opposed that. And when we got there, they said, we have begun to sell our shares in oil and gas companies. We've started this already, but we're not doing it for ethical reasons. We're doing it for financial reasons. And the reason why we're doing it is because we no longer see a future for investments in oil and gas companies. We do not see that there is likely to be significant growth. So us, for ethical reasons, Church of Scotland Investors Trust have come to the same conclusions. The report seeks to draw a line under that and call upon the Church of Scotland General Assembly to stop investments in fossil fuel companies. The third area, and maybe the most challenging to think about, and a really tough one, and this is where that response becomes difficult, just as David suggested in his reflections there. What would it mean for churches to say, we will go carbon neutral by 2030? We will stop emissions of greenhouse gases by 2030. That's a tough one. That means changing heating systems. It means a whole range of technical and financial problems. But if we are to respond effectively to climate change, if we are to follow the strong guidance shown by the Scottish Government saying that we must do this by 2045 at the very latest, if we are to take up the challenge that other churches have put down, such as the church in Finland and the Church of England, to say we will stop emissions of greenhouse gases, then that means that churches across Scotland will have to face up to the very difficult problems that involves. I can hear property conveners fainting in horror at the prospect, and it is a tough one. There's no getting away from it. That is the reality of responding to climate change. Maybe more excitingly, the COP is coming to Glasgow. Well, what is the COP? You should have received a little leaflet with an email that came out from Stephen this afternoon, little briefing sheet talking about the COP. To give it its full title, it is the 26th conference of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Hence, everybody, to cut through that, just refers to it as the COP or COP26. It was due originally to have been held in Brazil, but President Bolsonaro decided he didn't want it. The UK government put up his hand, said, we'll do it. And perhaps to some people's surprise, it was offered to Glasgow, to come to Glasgow in November this year. Then we have the disaster of the COVID pandemic, and it has been postponed for 12 months. COP26 will be coming to Glasgow in the first 2 weeks, all being well, the first 2 weeks of November 2021. Why is it important? As the number of conferences that have taken place suggest, progress has been painstakingly slow. 25 conferences so far, all trying to get international agreement to seriously tackle climate change, and the progress has been painful. However, in Paris in 2015, at COP21, there was significant progress, supported and encouraged by churches. And that progress was that there was an agreement at Paris that we must seek to contain global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, and if possible, limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Again, that's difficult. We're already 1 degree Celsius warmer than we were in the pre-industrial past. And if we continue with business as usual, we're likely to reach about 4 degrees Celsius global warming. So the commitment was made to try and limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, and countries were invited to submit plans as to how they would do that. That was done. All the plans were submitted, and someone in the United Nations added up the figures. And it was found that if all those plans were put into effect, global warming would be limited to 3 degrees Celsius, way above where we need to be. So that's a tough challenge for international governments. And why Glasgow is important is 5 years down the line, 6 years next year, countries are being invited to increase their ambition to say, if we're going to get down to 2 degrees Celsius, you really have to make more effort. It will be big, it'll be tough, but you can get involved. There will be ways for churches and other people to get involved through worship, through action, through advocacy. The little leaflet you have on the back some interesting ideas you might like to follow up. Those ideas will be developed. We'll be revising that as we go along. In worship, Climate Sunday is an initiative that churches together in Britain, Ireland put together. And there will be opportunities there in creation time to think about how we respond in worship, in prayer to this subject. In action, one idea David has been discussing and others are encouraging is, can we ring out a bell in warning in every church across the land? Can you ring out a bell to galvanize people into action? We'd like to get a big bell forged to present to Glasgow Cathedral for the COP. That's an ambition at this stage. You don't have the money or the plans to do it, but it's an aspiration. Do you have links to churches around the world? Do you have twinning arrangements? If so, what are you learning from your partner churches about climate change? What are they telling you about the problems in their town, in their country? That would be something very exciting to look at. So worship, action, and advocacy. In advocacy, there is being developed what's called the climate fringe. In many ways, the COP reflects the spirit of the Edinburgh Festival. At the heart of it, a core, which is the diplomats and the negotiators. Most of us get no end of that. Around that, a fringe. And as part of that fringe, churches will have a place. Stop Chaos Scotland, with support from churches, is developing a website called Climate Fringe. Watch how that develops. There will be opportunities to get involved. Thirdly, and finally, everything, including the COP, including churches, including businesses, including many people in our lives, in our homes, are thrown into disarray by the COVID-19 pandemic and all the chaotic consequences. This poses so many questions for how we organize our lives, how we organize businesses, how we organize the economy, and about how we recover from this. Do we just want to go back to where we were before, or are we looking for changes? How do we promote better health? How do we promote justice? How do we promote equality? How do we promote care for creation? In the sea of oil and gas, this has particular resonance. I'm aware that it's taking place. I know it's a difficult one, and I know there are difficult times for everyone. But there are positive developments taking place. A number of churches, including the Church of Scotland and 8 other partners, wrote the First Minister earlier this year calling for a just and green recovery. The First Minister and the Scottish Government have responded positively to this, and it will be debated in Parliament tomorrow afternoon. Hoping to watching that, you might to watch it too. Now, I hope that was reasonably getting one message up, that the sound quality has not been as good as we hoped. If there are any questions, clarification, I'd be very happy to take this now. So I'd like to pose some questions for you to take away to workshops. Young people's lives will be changed by climate change. How do we listen to young people in churches? As we come out of lockdown, what do you want to see change, and why do you want to see it change? And how do you help that about? Judith, thank you.
Well, actually, Stephen has got the magic button for putting everybody into breakout rooms. So in a moment, you should see coming up on your screen the opportunity to join a breakout room. So if you go to that breakout room, it's just for discussing that question which Adrian has just posed to you about young people's lives. Will they be changed by climate change? And how can you listen to the young people? So that's that first question to think about in your wee group. I think we're going to give you roughly 5 minutes in that.